Hello everyone and welcome to day 22 of the longer form explanation in the Proponomics Advent Calendar, and today is about transitory versus secular inflation. So what do those two phrases mean first of all? Well, transitory inflation is inflation that simply passes through like a spike through the system. So it's moving along through the system. It's started by a particular event that happens and then abates. So in the case of the pandemic, the type of transitory inflation we're talking about is because oil stopped being pumped out the ground for a short while, or trees stopped being planted and started being felled. It meant that when there was continued demand, which wasn't expected during the pandemic, then price of things went up massively. But these were one-off shock, supply side style shocks. And of course, price of fuel also being more popular than was expected means that it costs more money to move things around, goods around from A to B, which includes all of the food that we eat. So that's the notion of transitory inflation. The problem with using the phrase transitory is, of course, it might be transitory over a period of 30 or 40 years. But at this point, it looks like we've seen a period of around 2 to 3 years where that inflation has been somewhat transitory, and some things have returned to nearly the price they were before the pandemic when it comes to raw materials and commodities. And of course, we've had a significant amount of inflation in the system since then. So in real terms, so prices after they've been adjusted for inflation, some of those raw materials are actually cheaper today than they were before the pandemic. Now, what does secular inflation mean on the other side of the fence? It means inflation that's going to remain in the system with some level of permanency. So, very typically, after pandemics in the past, there have been significant inflationary times that have persisted for decades and decades afterwards, perhaps 30 or 40 years. And why has that been the case? Well, if you go back 400 or 500 years ago to examples of pandemics, one of the things that inevitably happened is, unfortunately, a lot of the labour force were affected and they died younger than they would have done. They passed away, and therefore there was a shortage of labour. And that meant that labour cost more money, and that pushed up the price of goods, because the more money it costs to produce something, the more your input costs go up as a business, the more you have to sell those products for in order to be able to afford to produce them at a profit, or at least not make a loss if you're hanging on. So there's this notion of secular inflation that also exists. And now here's the truth about this debate, and this is so often the truth in these situations. For some reason, people try and peg themselves into one camp or the other. You must believe in transitory inflation or not, or you must believe in secular inflation or not. You have to defend your position like you're defending your favourite football team or a particular religion, or with similar sort of fervour. Whereas in reality, that's just not the truth at all. The truth is there's some from column A and there's some from column B. Of course, there was always an element of the inflation that was experienced post-pandemic that was going to be transitory. But of course, it's also fairly easy to follow the arguments as to why some of that transitory inflation may stay behind and become secular, and where there also may be a secular element to that inflation. Now, this time round, after this pandemic, we have seen still a constriction in the supply of labour, not for the same reasons, not because COVID killed so many people off. Obviously, there were a large number of deaths worldwide, but not a large percentage compared to, for example, the amount of the population that would have been wiped out in 1665 by the Black Death or something equivalent. But it did something else to people. It made them stop. It made them pause. It led to this thing they call the Great Resignation in the UK. In the US, they've called it the Big Quit. It's also led to a vast rise in long-term sickness as well. There's nearly 500,000 more people outside of the workforce of employable age, as the Office for National Statistics deems it, than there were at the end of 2019. Nearly 500,000 people on long-term sick. Some of this because of the pressure on the NHS, of course, that's been placed on it by the pandemic. So many more people out of the workforce for different reasons. They haven't passed away. They're not necessarily permanently out of the workforce. Some have taken early retirement, for example. There are more students than there were at this point 4 years ago. But for all of those reasons, there's less labour available. There's still more job vacancies out there today than there's ever been before the pandemic, even though it's come down from its extremely high spike. So what happens in these situations? Lower supply of labour, significant demand for labour, wages get bid up. What happens when wages get bid up? People get those wages, and guess what they do with the money? They spend it. Now, to an extent, some of it is trying to catch up with the old days. The inflation came first this time around, and then the wage rises lagged behind a little bit. But when these wage rises in 2024 kick in, and they'll be starting to get ahead of where inflation has been for the last several years, then we'll see what happens, because what tends to happen in consumption-driven economies like the UK and like the US, in the Western world in general, is that money gets spent. It doesn't necessarily get saved. And as it gets spent, it then gets reinvested into more profits. Wage demands continue getting higher, and this is how you end up with what's called a wage price spiral. Now, that's the sort of inflation that we've actually avoided thus far in this cycle, but there's not necessarily anything stopping that from happening in 2024. And there's obviously a secular element to that. There isn't a transitory one-off event such as the Panama Canal has been shut down, as we saw what happened when that got blocked, and it causes a bit of a blockage in goods around the world. Although, of course, there are issues in the Red Sea at the moment with goods, and around 12%, I think, of the world's trade goes through the Red Sea in terms of goods. So it's obviously an extremely important strategic location, and that's something that could lead to more transitory inflation. Secular inflation has embedded itself within the system. And my point is, there's some transitory and there's some secular here, and that's what we need to consider as we go forward with our analysis into 2024.